Because of revisionist historians and far-left propaganda, many believe that the FBI's obsession with Mr. Michael King II was because of J. Edgar Hoover's racism towards and hatred towards the African American, the so-called black community. This idea is false. Whether people like Hoover or not, that's not really my point. Whenever one tries to tell you that a major situation is caused by and only by one problem, then it is a major sign that someone is revising and withholding both major and minor details in order to create a narrative. For the most part, at that time, the FBI was fighting against communism, which Martin Luther King Jr. had many ties with. The person who was responsible for the case against King was Assistant Director William C. Sullivan. Sullivan was actually a self-described liberal, and he stated about Mr. King, and I quote, "I was 100% for King because I saw him as an effective and badly needed leader for the black people and their desire for civil rights," would change Sullivan's mind on Martin Luther King Jr. Sullivan sought and actually confirmed that King was a communist, a hypocrite, a false Christian, and an immoral degenerate. And before I go further along, in my opinion, the fatal flaw with these type of people, and people in general in America, is that they believe that blacks needed a quote-unquote black messiah figure to lead them to the promised land, which was really them getting more and more government benefits. Because in our modern age, many people have turned their backs on the Most High and swallowed the liberal and Marxist doctrine. Many people do not understand the evils of communism. Because our education system and other mediums have become Marxist indoctrination camps, that caused people to lack the understanding of the history of the threat of communism to the world. The FBI's main goals during that time, especially during the civil rights era, was to expose communism that was infiltrating our schools, the homes, and even the government. However, many ignored and became deceived of the horrors of communism. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, called King, and I quote, "the most notorious liar in the world." He also said King is a tomcat with obsessive degenerate urges. Later, he then told Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, part of the Kennedy crime family, the civil rights movement is headed by communists and moral degenerates who pose a danger to the nations. Which poses this question. Was Martin Luther King a Marxist? Was he a communist? King's associate advisor and personal secretary from 1955 to 1960 was Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a member of the New York City Communist Party, which was established, I believe, in 1936. Rustin also had a jail record for draft dodging and even lewd vagrancy and homosexual perversion. In 1958, Rustin was the one that organized the first of King's marches on Washington. The newspaper of the Communist Party, The Worker, openly declared the march to be a communist project. Though Rustin was let go as a secretary, eventually he became the second in charge of the infamous 1963 March on Washington. King did not deny the communist ties at this point. Now, Rustin's replacement was Jack Odell, also known as Hunter Pitts Odell. Odell was a member of the National Committee of the Communist Party USA. He was a communist as early as 1956 and was also given the job of acting director for the SCLC, Southeastern Division. According to the St. Louis Global Democrat, 1962, a communist has infiltrated the top administrative posts in the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s SCLC. He is Jack H. Odell, acting executive director of conference activities in the southeastern states, including Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. At this time, the communist infiltration, or the Red Scare, was becoming more and more public at this time. Therefore, when Odell's communist ties got out into the public, King publicly fired him, but privately rehired him as the director of the New York City office of the SCLCs. Again, we see that King kept people who were openly known as communists very close to him, which goes back to Amos, the third chapter, the third verse. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Now, let's go back to Stanley Levinson, who I mentioned earlier. Stanley Levinson was another of King's closest friend and advisor. Levinson was a Jewish communist and is best described as the Emperor Palpatine behind the scenes who handled Darth Vader, aka Michael King II. Levinson was in charge of secretly funneling Soviet Union funds to the Communist Party USA. He was also King's mentor and wrote most of King's speeches. The FBI was aware of Levinson's communist ties, which was the initial reasons why the FBI put their interest in King in the first place. Levinson edited King's book, Stride Towards Freedom. It was Levinson who arranged for a publisher. Levinson even prepared King's income tax returns, right? It was Levinson who really controlled the fundraising and agitation activities of the SCLCs. And after King's death, his wife Coretta Scott King even described Levinson's role as, and I quote, always working in the background. His contribution has been indispensable. Communists also promoted King, right? A number of communists who left the party have reported they were ordered to do all within their power to support King's activities.
There's one thing that bothers me, and that as a Negro yourself, why do you talk so bitterly against Martin Luther King and a lot of these other people of your race?
Well, let me tell you something. I don't put my race before I do my country. Being a Negro woman doesn't matter to me who is a Negro or who is a white person. If they are enemies of our country, then they are certainly my enemies too. Well, I say it is frightening, and it should be frightened to the entire American people that he has demanded $10 billion. And if he doesn't get it, then there may be riots this summer. Martin Luther King is nothing but a blackmailer, and he should be arrested for blackmailing because he certainly has blackmailed the United States government.
A black woman and undercover agent for the FBI, Julia Brown, was a communist in Cleveland for 9 years. She said, "We were told to promote King to unite Negroes and whites behind him and to turn him into sort of a national hero. We were to look to King as the leader in this struggle," the communist said, "because he was on our side. While in the party, I learned that King attended a communist training school, that several of his aides were communists, and that he received funds from communists and took direction from them. He was one of their biggest heroes." U.S. Congressional Record of March 30th, 1965 holds Carl Prussian, an FBI counterspy inside the Communist Party, as swearing at all of these meetings, the Communist Party meetings. Reverend Martin Luther King was always set forth as an individual to whom communists should rally around. King has either been a member of or wittingly accepted support from over 60 communist fronts. In 1957, Dr. King, so-called Dr. King, addressed the Highland Folk School in Montego, Tennessee, which was originally called the Commonwealth College until it was cited by the House Committee on Un-American Activities as being a communist front on April 27, 1949. The committee found that Commonwealth, later the Highlander Folk School, was using religion as a way to infiltrate the so-called black community by, among other techniques, comparing the texts of the New Testaments to those of Karl Marx. Ain't that something? Man, whatever. Martin Luther King knew many of the known communists associated with the Highlander schools. It is shown in this picture that I'm showing you right now. Dr. King was praised by communists and promoted by fellow travelers. Communist official Benjamin J. Davis in The Worker, November 10, 1963, describes Mr. King as a brilliant and practical leader who articulates the philosophy of the Negro people for direct, nonviolent mass action, and the foremost advocate of the solution of social problems through nonviolent methods of mass action. Martin Luther King expresses a communist outlook in his book, Stride Towards Freedom. He states that, in spite of the shortcomings of his analysis, Marx has some basic questions. I was deeply concerned from my early teen days about the gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, and my readings of Marx made me even more conscious of this gulf. Although modern American capitalism has greatly reduced the gap through social reforms, there was still need for a better distribution of wealth. Moreover, Marx had revealed the danger of the profit motive as the sole basis of the economic system. In short, I read Marx as I read all of the influential historical thinkers from a dialectical point of view, combining a partial yea and a partial no. My readings of Marx convinced me that truth is found neither in Marxism nor in traditional capitalism. Each represents a partial truth. Historically, capitalism failed to see truth in collective enterprise, and Marxism failed to see the truth in individual enterprise. The kingdom of God is neither the thesis of individual enterprise nor the antithesis of collective enterprise, but a synthesis which reconciles the truths of both. Here we go, Michael King II, thinking like communists, such as Marx, Lenin, or Stalin. The dialectic always, it can only lead to dictatorship and destruction of a society. Man cannot, for example, be half free and half slave. Either he is free or he is a slave. Dr. King's stance towards his own people would stand in contrast to an advocacy of genuine freedom, the development of self-rule, self-sufficiency, private ownership, and the accumulation of capital resulting from achievement. Dr. King was actually not advocating the American system of free market capitalism, which, side note, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, but instead, Martin Luther King stood for a system that has stunted the growth of African Americans as well as all races, which is capitalism, but with government restrictions and backings, which in reality is not capitalism at all, but socialism. The sorrowful point of this is that the most influential leader of the civil rights movement wasn't an advocate of the capitalism that was already leading to such great economic strides amongst the so-called black community in his day. By advocating a better, quote-unquote, distribution of wealth, he meant state control over the economy, aka the welfare state. He sneered at the profit motive without explaining why blacks shouldn't seek to profit to the best of their ability. These ideas would later on open the floodgates to radical black leaders such as Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown. Then you had the Black Panthers. Then you also had the burning and looting of the so-called black communities and neighborhoods, the institution of the welfare state, the perpetuation of poverty, the destruction of the black family, drugs, violence, quote-unquote racism, and, crime, the stuff that we see today, all the issues that we see today in the black community. This is simply why I do not think that the civil rights movement was a success. I believe that the civil rights movement actually was an ultimate failure more than Reconstruction. In 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, the 3rd verse, the word tells us that a qualification for a preacher or a deacon or a bishop is to be, and I quote, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. According to Sullivan, King embezzled or misapplied substantial amounts of money contributed to the quote-unquote civil rights movement. King used the SCLC funds to pay for liquors, prostitutes, which were often brought back to his hotel rooms to engage in orgy parties. One of Martin Luther King Jr.'s closest friend was a man named Ralph Abernathy. Ralph Abernathy wrote in his 1989 autobiography, "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down," about Martin Luther King's infidelity, and even devotes a whole chapter talking about the affairs of the so-called Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had. This includes a story about the night before King's assassination at the Lorraine Motel, that King had a drunken orgy party where he watched two females being not only sexualized but physically abusive, and he was just chilling watching it happen, on that SML type of stuff. So I ask you this: what did Ralph Abernathy had to gain by exposing a story like this? By this time, Martin Luther King Jr. already was immortalized with statues, street names, depicted as the Black Christ, and had a national holiday. Abernathy actually had the King mob after him, such as Jesse Jackson, famed race hustler who worked with King also, Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young, and others. Abernathy had way much more to lose than to gain. Also, when there is smoke, there is usually fire. The FBI and others mentioned that King was adulterous, which disqualifies you to the role of a pastor because you are required to be blameless, the husband of one wife, not given to wine, not covetous, according to 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter. Yet there is plenty of allegations and witnesses that he was all of those things. According to FBI reports, many leaders had described Martin Luther King of being, and I quote, a heavy consumer of alcoholic beverages, and is known to certain Negro leaders to be extremely loose in his moral behavior. When King attended a Negro Baptist convention in Memphis, himself and other ministers arranged to rent from some families' apartments at a housing project, and the permanent tenants were advised that the apartments were needed for quote-unquote meditations. However, instead of meditating on the scriptures, they meditated on orgies, and the apartments were used for sex and drinking parties. In plenty of instances, Reverend King got so drunk that he had to be physically restrained, and I quote, so tenants wouldn't see him selling the image of him and the civil rights movement. In 1964, December 16th, in Norway, Banner Rustin, an advisor for King, spoke of an incident where King and his friends had the police called on them. King was in Norway to receive his Nobel Peace Prize. The cops came to their hotel room around 4 in the morning, catching a prostitute coming out of A.D. King's room. Rustin had to talk to the police out of arresting the prostitute in order to avoid besmirching the reputation of Martin Luther King. Rustin also stated that King and his colleagues had naked white hoes running up and down the hotel halls. Probably trying to show them that he was free at last, know what I mean? Another incident of King's infidelity was from a dentist in Los Angeles on February 20th, 1968. On surveillance, a Los Angeles dentist was caught trying to kill King, forcing him to leave the city. The reason being is because this dentist, who was a former supporter, discovered that his wife engaged in weird sexual affairs with King. Look, whether you agree or disagree with the FBI wiretapping King, that's not the topic of this presentation. The FBI wired King's office and hotel rooms from 1963 to 68. These tapes not only recorded his transactions with communist agents, but also wild and sometimes homosexual sex orgies, which included acts of perversion. We also have supporters, close associates, and friends confirming that King was a sexual degenerate, a drinker, and all of that bad stuff. President Lyndon B. Johnson, after listening to the FBI tapes of King's sex orgies, he said, gosh darn it, if only you could hear what the hypocritical preacher does sexually. It is not as if all of these accusations came from nothing. Honestly, if you want to believe that the FBI was just out to get another poor black leader, then it would be very petty to write over 800 pages of lies in the FBI documents. I mean, honestly, that would just seem petty to a degree far beyond the congregation of the Most High. However, we are not able to listen or see the FBI files until 2027. However, with the knowledge that has been leaked, has been revealed, is this the type of man you want your children to follow? Better yet, is this the type of reverend you want leading your church? I will state again that these evidences presented in this presentation were not pulled from the sky, but are easily and undeniably provable. We need to understand as well that the American media, especially during the 1960s, was already controlled by leftist communists and was already crafting the narrative to make King be portrayed like the Black Messiah. And just how the liberal media acts today, if you oppose King, you were usually deemed as a racist and against the civil rights of Negroes. Edgar J. Hoover did try to present this information to the media and even government officials, but the fix was already in. Martin Luther King Jr. was the communist and media's darling and cannot allow you to know the actual truth of your so-called American hero. On January 31st, 1977, Coretta Scott King obtained a federal court order sealing for 50 years the 845 pages of FBI records about her husband because, and I quote, its release would destroy his reputation. The words from her mouth. Even knowing this truth, a spineless Congress voted to make King's birthday a national holiday. Michael King II was a communist whom surrounded himself around communists and pushed Marxism to the American public, with black people being used as a proverbial lab rat. He called himself a Christian preacher, but he denied Christ, denied the word of God as truth, and was a drunkard, adulterous, and a sexual degenerate. He also didn't even have a will for his family, even though there was countless of death threats and assassination attempts for him to think about giving his inheritance to his family. A Christian man, right? He claimed to be a scholar, but plagiarized the majority of his papers and speeches. Though the administrations knew about his plagiarism, they ignored his plagiarism and passed him anyway. He is a self-proclaimed pacifist that ensued violence wherever he went. This man is a liar and has deceived people onto the crooked path. This is why you must know the truth. You must love the truth. And I hope I have convinced you to stop worshiping people other than Christ and the Most High. So peace.